So for anyone who's new to the process, I'm Paul Tomaschek, one of the associate deans in liberal arts and sciences, and I'm joined by Kelly Rowe, who is associate dean in School of Communication, Media, and Arts, Rayhan Khan, and Michelle Thornton, who between them are something like associate dean in the School of Business. Um, depending on how you divide those things, and Carol Willard, who's Associate Dean in the School of Education. And we're the ones who, oh, and there's Rebecca Mushter in room 123. She's the Associate Dean in the graduate studies. So we're the ones who have to deal with most of the academic integrity violation stuff and academic integrity stuff in general. And most semesters, we give some sort of summary of what's going on this semester or an update on processes or whatever. Um, we have been piloting this past academic year a submission for academic integrity reporting um, that is aimed at accomplishing multiple things. So the system that we've been using is Maxient, which is used extensively in the student affairs side of things. It was at the time an upgrade from what we had been doing before. The attempt is to try to, at the same time, lower the burden on instructors and give us on the administrative side a bit more uh, control, a bit more ability to see what's going on across the units. Uh, in the past year, we have been working with Andrew Buckman in the Advisement Center, who's one of our gurus on Starfish. And we have a Starfish flag for academic integrity. And it's something that some people we advised, some people who we have suspicions are going to have academic integrity issues because of the nature of their class or whatever. We tipped them off about this to say, hey, why don't you give this a try? Some other people just discovered it in the process of being in Starfish. It's the first thing that you see when you go to the flag drop down. The reporting side puts with Starfish puts a lot less burden on you as reporters. There's no more a series of boxes that you have to fill in with student demographic information and this and that. And it, I think that it has the potential of significantly uh, unburdening reporters. The the question is though what we want to see in these Starfish flags. So the benefit, of course, is that you as an instructor have access in Starfish to all of the students that you have in your classes. So they're automatically right there. You can just go in, put the student name, student shows up, go to the flag, and write what you want to write. And the prompt gives you a little bit of information about what we're hoping for. Um, but realistically, what we want is a brief account of the situation. So students were caught cheating on an exam, and I saw them do this, and I told them at the time. Um, Naturally, with uh, less concrete or more ambiguous situations, it requires a little bit more writing. But we're not looking for a multi-paragraph synopsis of the history of plagiarism and its effect on modern civilization. We're looking for the real fundaments of what happened. We're looking also for an indication of whether you've been able to talk to the student about this. Um, when it comes to it, I've received a couple of these notifications that are extremely terse, 2 lines, and it doesn't say, whether the student was contacted. It doesn't say anything, but that's really fine because I see it as soon as you hit submit. All of the associate deans have it sent to them. So whether it is in the School of Ed or in the School of Business, I see it when it comes in. Um, so if it's a student that I know something about, I can talk to Rayhan. If it's a question that I have about the situation, I can talk to Carol. So we all then have a lot of potential for discussing these situations. If it's a student in CLAS and I really don't get the radiant gist from what was written, I can write to the instructor and say, did you talk to the student? If you did, what did they say? Are you certain about, you said that there was you suspected AI use. How is it that you came to this conclusion? How certain are you about this? And ultimately, what is the penalty that you're considering? And it's at that point that we can have a discussion about, well, this is not really serious, so I'm not sure what might be done as a penalty. So it's good from our standpoint because we get the information that is shared amongst us, and we have the ability to immediately go to the instructor and get more information or help them through the process. And really, for the instructor, that's it. It may be that we ask for some other supporting documentation. It may be that we say, this sounds fine to me. If the student appeals, you'll need to present some additional documentation, but at very least, it takes the immediate burden off of you. So we are hoping to broadcast more widely that this is um, something that is available in, uh, I guess, before the fall semester begins. Um, is the Starfish notice a replacement of the Maxient form? The hope is that it is a replacement of the Maxient form, that we to remove that from the integrity website and people stop using that altogether.
Oh, could I just add one thing? I just wanted to mention that the Starfish flag does not go to the student.
Right.
So that doesn't count as notification or contacting the student. That has to be done separately from that Starfish flag. And in that, your commentary on the Starfish flag, you should, talk about whether or not you've contacted the student and what the result of that was.
Yeah. So it's, again, if you just put something brief in, let's say you're grading 1 million final papers and you want to get this report in, but you really don't want to spend the time with all the this, that, and the other documentation, you can put the flag in and wait for your associate dean to contact you with the, hey, I see you put a flag in. There's not a lot of detail here. Catch me up on what happened. And in that conversation, we would no doubt say, okay, we support you on this. This all makes sense. Make sure that you inform the student of what your conclusion is on it, because we like to make sure that the loop gets closed on these things. And again, in most cases, after the conversation with the student, the matter is largely taken care of and there isn't an appeal. And if it's a situation where you talk to the student, you say, I have concerns that this doesn't sound like you. The student confesses, yeah, I used AI. And you say, okay, well, my syllabus says that I do this on this. I'm going to think about it for a while, but you should expect that I'm going to do something within this range of things. And you can inform them that they have the right to appeal, and it's not something that they really need to be told about because it exists. And if they're uh, if they're reading the undergraduate catalog, they'll see that that is something that they can do. But if it's a student who has admitted doing something, that's generally the end of it at that point. If it's a student who hasn't admitted something, then it's likely that things are going to follow on from that. But really getting the violation report in from our standpoint is the most important thing, because again, we're not doing this from the standpoint of police state. We're doing this from the standpoint of those small number of students who are serial violators, who are the ones that we want to be able to track for some sort of pattern of behavior. so that maybe they did something minor in your class, but next semester they do something that maybe isn't quite so minor in another class. At that point, we've got two data points rather than just one thing in isolation. And that means that we are very likely to have a conversation with that student above and beyond whatever penalties they may have received in classes. So what we really want is for the process to be easy enough for you as instructors to have no compunctions about putting in the report so that we can see who's doing what over time. And yeah, that's really the long and the short of it. If it's realistically, if it's a senior who's graduating who did something minor in a class, okay, that's not something that is likely to develop into anything. But from your standpoint as instructor, you shouldn't have to be thinking about, well, what if the student did this or did that? Just think about your class, think about what happened, and base what you do on that, and let us do the heavier lifting beyond that. So, your thoughts? Go ahead, Lynn.
Hi, sorry I was late. I was searching for the Zoom link, but um, I'm here because I already did this on Starfish because Paul and I had a chat and it was actually very easy. But one thing I did do, which I'd like to get your thoughts on, Paul, and everyone else, is I went back and wrote an email to myself and kept track of everything that I had done with the student in regard to um, this issue of this academic violation. Um, and I kept really good notes about when I spoke to him, what happened, what we talked about, when things happened. And that way, if you have further questions later, or the student has further questions, then everything's all documented. And I did it immediately after I submitted the Starfish violation. And I still have it in my email, which I think is really helpful. So I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Well, it's good to hear that I'm not the only person who sends emails to themselves. But yeah, if it is an absolute clear-cut case, you talk to the student admitted something, maybe the notes are not hugely useful there, but I think having an overabundance of caution is good, especially if it's a case where the student contends that they didn't do anything. They have until a short period of time into the next semester to appeal. So it's not something that's going to drag on for years, but it's certainly something that has the potential of having, of cropping up some months later, especially if it's spring going into fall. So it's it's good to put yourself in a position that if a student contests it, that you're not going to be left with, well, at the time I thought this, but now I'm not so sure. Having some notes is a good thing. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, I would echo what Lynn said. Well, in just that, first of all, obviously the Starfish, I used both yesterday, the Starfish and the form. Starfish is super simple, but I can also imagine a situation so my case was a little bit different since I have so many students that are involved in this. And so I had a spreadsheet and I had dates and all of these things that I was keeping track of. But I can imagine a situation where I just had that one off. If all I was sort of prompted to do was that basic accounting for it in the Starfish thing, I might not, let's say this was my first time as a faculty member doing it, I might not necessarily, what I like about the Maxine form, even though I hated doing it because there was so much there, it forced me to really clarify and specify the dates of when things happen and tracking on things in such a way that I think then keeps better records of it. And so I can envision a situation in the future of sort of tripping myself up because there isn't as much of a prompt of keeping track of everything in the Starfish form. And so that's all I would say is even maybe there's a companion form or like something like tips for faculty on record keeping of these are the things, even though you don't have to submit all of this stuff, you might want to have a folder in your desktop or keep track of something for the future, because at the time when it happens, it's much easier to remember than it is if a student appeals it down the road at some point. So that would just be my suggestion. I like the lowering the barrier, but then also providing some suggestions or tips for faculty on how to be successful in a future situation if we didn't require that of them up front.
I think that's a really good point. I think that, there is always a cost, and the cost of having it be less labor intensive on the front end could be that you're inadvertently screwing yourself on the back end. So, um, it would be good when we follow up with instructors if we could mention, um, you know, what do you have for notes on this? What do you have if someone comes back on, September 30th, which is within the range of appealable times? What are you going to do at that point? So it's, I think it's important, in particular for those cases that may not be cut and dried and where the penalty is significant.
I have a question, Paul. What
ahead.
can students appeal? This appeal period you're saying is about sort of a final grade appeal or sort of a grade on any assignment in any class?
Yeah, so the appeal of intellectual integrity violations follows the grade appeal process in the catalog. And the grade appeal process in the catalog, which I'm just going to now so that I have
Well,
the
that's
word.
been recently changed in faculty assembly though, actually.
This part of it hasn't.
Okay.
So the date part of it, it is, yeah, it's the end of the 6th week, so it's the convenient, it's in sync with the incomplete grade change process. But a student has, they can wait until the end of the 6th week, which would be October something, to decide, well, I'm going to appeal this. And if you as the instructor haven't thought about this, let's say that it's something that the student had a penalty back in March, that could be March, April, May, June, July, August, September, nearly 8 months later that they're coming with, yeah, I want to appeal this. And the appeal goes to the department chair, and the department chair is going to ask you for, what did you do? And at that point, if you have only vague recollections of things, it's not going to be great. It's not that it's a disaster, it's just that it would be better to have something where here's the exam that the student cheated on, or here's the paper where I've highlighted the passages that were plagiarized. Here's a copy of the email chain back and forth with the student about this. The basic, none of these appeals require a super normal amount of evidence in them, but generally the vaguer it is, the more you probably want to cover yourself with, here's why I made the decision that I made. The change to the grade appeal process is really just, and it is something that is probably going to come into play with intellectual integrity. If I, can prophesy something, because I have some instructors who have said, I'm penalizing this student because I think they used AI on this paper. And there's not a lot more than just this student, that this paper is too much better than the previous papers. They must have somehow done something untoward. And if the student admits, yeah, I used ChatGPT on this, then fine. Student has admitted this, then it's still appealable, but it's nothing that's going to go anywhere. If a student from the get-go says, I never used AI on this, I worked hard on this paper, I incorporated your feedback. Yes, it's a much better paper, but it's a much better paper because I did the things that you told me to do. That's a situation where if it gets appealed, if it was a serious penalty that caused the student to fail a class or that caused the student who was doing well in the class to not do well, then I can certainly see an associate dean saying, I'm really uncomfortable with this determination because it it lacks it lacks real objective backing. And I will just say that there have been cases that I've seen that I I don't have great faith in. Um, so those are things that could go on to the newly developed next stage of appeal, which you know, faculty chosen from around get to look at it and they get to make up their minds about, was this a legitimately applied penalty, or is it not supportable? And then they get to decide what to do. So
Excellent. Then thank you. Another question though. So back to the starfish flags now. So the students, if one were to, if a faculty member were to raise this flag, the student is not alerted. Is the student ever alerted? I mean, thinking about this from a student perspective, it could just sort of come out of the blue at someone someday that they suddenly have
right, and
suspicion somehow.
and we would like to not have that happen. If a faculty member has made a decision that the student has done something that is outside the bounds of intellectual honesty, then they need to tell the student, we've had this discussion about this, and after having that discussion, I've determined this. And basically let the student know that despite the fact that you say that you didn't use AI, I think that the evidence is too strong, and here's what I'm doing about it. Here's the penalty. And at that point, it's important to say you have the right to appeal. Go to the undergraduate catalog and look at the rules there. But
I think just
the rules exist at the graduate level too.
Yeah.
It's also in the graduate catalog. But I also wanted to just note that like the reason why we set it up in Starfish the way that we did is so that really low level academic integrity issues are still recorded. We don't, if there's not really an academic penalty, right, it was treated as a learning moment, then we have a way to track that that's happened 10 times. And then that's a real problem versus, like you don't need as much like evidence.
I agree
do that.
entirely. And I
then
part of the guidance would be to make sure that the faculty member informs the student that it has gone into Starfish and is part of a permanent record, even if the penalties are not egregious, even if the penalties are not extreme. It's not, I don't know that I've heard in the guidance that there's this express communication to the student that there is a lasting record of this for them.
Yeah, I mean, the policy does say that the faculty member is responsible for communicating with the student and telling them that. So that's important. The reason why it's set up to not automatically notify the student is so that it can be used as a mechanism to support faculty who are exploring whether or not it's academic integrity, rather than like not doing something. And so the flag can be raised even if they haven't contacted the student yet, so that they can get some support from their associate dean to help guide them through that process, or their chair.
Michelle, you have your hand up.
Yeah, the only thing that I would say is that I hope that the plans are in the works to update the website language on this, because right now like if a student, I fully expect many of my students yesterday are going to appeal because that did result in a failing grade. And so the language right now reflects a totally different policy than what we're talking about. And so those students, I suspect then, right, they're going to look to what the policy says in terms of that faculty will submit that Maxant report. There's a whole host of other things about kind of the process that would happen. And kind of what we're talking about now, that more streamlined version isn't really reflected there. And so I think to Rebecca's point, right, is that I could kind of walk away from this and be like, oh, well, I did the Starfish thing. I did everything I'm supposed to, but then not be protected actually by the institution because the policy online says something else. And if a student or their parents are like, but you didn't do all these things that you said you're going to do. So I think all this is sensitive enough that we just need to make sure that really the policy, the website language, and what we're teaching faculty to do is all really consistent.
Yes. And Rebecca is working hard on that policy. So any final thoughts? John is prompting us to.
I have a quick question.
Carolina.
Yes. So I know that some of the instructors are using AI and actually encourage the students to do it. I guess this is still a minority of the instructors. Is there a mechanism where the freshman students are actually told or instructed or advised by their advisors not to use this because the majority of the professors wouldn't appreciate that? I'm just curious. I don't use AI yet. My kids don't use it yet, so I don't know. But I noticed, for some comments that some of the students use it and some of the colleagues, even for emails, they mention, in this type of meetings that they use it. So, I'm just thinking from the perspective of the student, are the freshman students aware that while some very few professors appreciate this, then the majority is still mainstream. And of course, if you plagiarize or if you do AI, that's not exactly what you are expected to do. So I just want to, to understand things in a larger perspective.
I think that I think that every instructor needs to make clear to students in their course where they draw the line, where, I have a zero tolerance policy, or yeah, we're going to use AI for these things, but we can't use them for these things. Because of the fact, like you point out, that there's such variability with the use in different areas that it could be confusing to a student. So I think we're definitely in a place where every course, every instructor needs to be particularly clear about here's in our class how we're going to do this and where it becomes a penalty. So John says there's a symposium on AI next Tuesday addressing these and many other questions. There are also 8 workshops, 8, count them, addressing AI in classes. There's a follow-up session at 10:30 in 1 minute. If you'd like to talk more about this, we'll be there. So thanks for showing up.
Thank you.